Well, thank you all for coming here. I'm going to be talking a little bit about part of my PhD work. Specifically, this part is about the role of different parts of sexual selection and their role in signal evolution. So if we look broadly across animal taxa, it's clear that closely related populations and species often differ in sexual signals. And this suggests that sexual selection is broadly important in the production of biodiversity. Sexual selection is defined broadly as differential mating success and operates through two primary mechanisms, competition for mates and female choice. We can also have interaction of both of these if females choose their mates based on the outcomes of competitive interactions. So sexual selection has been studied broadly in the lab and field settings, but investigators have typically considered unimodal signals, so just looking at the effects of visual signals on mate choice or just acoustic signals on mate choice, when in fact mating systems in the wild are often more complex. So for example, we know now that visual and acoustic signals are important in squirrel tree frogs. And similarly, visual and seismic cues are important in mate choice in wolf spiders. And visual and olfactory cues, just as another example, are important in mate choice in butterflies. So there's increasing effort to understand biologically relevant complexity in the animal kingdom. And one outstanding question in this area is why signal in multiple modalities at all when signaling in one would probably be more cost efficient. And one reason for this might be that signals are redundant, and so they could act as backups in a noisy environment, or if one signal is included, for example, if you can't see the signal or you can hear them. You could also have increased receiver stimulation if both of the signals combined produce a greater response in the receiver. You could also improve the chance of reception, again, in noisy environments commonly encountered in the wild. So an example of this is in Schizocosa utzi, in which the seismic cue isolated or the visual cue isolated produce the same response from a receiver as both signals combined. You could also have multiple messages in which you could get greater information from receivers, which should reduce search costs. So this should be important in mate choice. So for example, in satin bowerbirds, UV plumage has been shown to predict intensity of blood parasite infection, while the overall symmetry of the bower predicts ectoparasite loads. So a potential limitation of this approach is that by looking at simply the effects of the presence of a visual cue or the absence of a visual cue when combined with an acoustic signal, is that you miss out on the interactions of multiple components within a modality. And as we know, visual signals are not just presence-absent, there's a lot of nuance, so you have different dimensions of color, different patterns, and so these interactions across components within modalities could be very important for signaling. So phenotype networks offer an alternative approach for looking at this. So here different shapes represent different modalities, and for example, two different triangles represent two different dimensions of color. And we can look at broad population patterns of relationships between traits to infer something about the redundancy of these traits. So for example, in this diagram, squares represent different aspects of morphology, such as body size or bill length, and then circles represent different aspects of song, such as the frequency or pitch of the signal or the temporal patterning of the signal. And in this case, we have non-redundancy within and across modalities. So, for example, bill length is unrelated to overall body size, and pitch and trill rate are unrelated to each other. So there's no redundancy in the system. Alternatively, you could have redundancy across modalities. So any particular, or one song trait reinforces another morphological trait, but song traits are unrelated to other song traits. You could also have redundancy within modalities. So here, all of the morphological traits reinforce each other, they're all correlated, and all song traits reinforce each other, but song is unrelated to morphology. And lastly, we could have redundancy within and across modalities. So here we have, so some of these song traits are related to some morphological traits, So we have sort of a combination of redundancy and non-redundancy, which allows for independent information to be encoded while allowing for redundancy within modalities. And so this is a pattern that's been proposed in the literature as a theoretical optimum that allows for maximum robustness to signal occlusion while allowing for independent information to be conveyed across these different trait clusters. And in the literature, they've referred to this as robust over-design, although some people hate this term because of the design aspect. But it's a useful baseline expectation for how signaling networks should evolve to convey information effectively. So to look at signal evolution using these phenotype network approaches, we studied the North American barn swallow, which is a semi-colonial migratory songbird in which males arrive early during the breeding season and defend territories and females choose mates. And this subspecies based on dark ventral plumage. So what do these phenotypes look like? Here's a male barn swallow, and we measured wing length, tail streamer length, which we considered morphology. We had 3 dimensions of color along a ventral transect, including throat, breast, belly, and vent. And we also measured different frequency and temporal parameters of song. So a typical song here represented in this spectrogram, we have seconds on the X and frequency in kilohertz on the Y, and this is what they sound like. Not the most beautiful song, but I learned to love it. And so songs are comprised of syllables, like this, which make up a warble collectively. And then at the end of each song, you have a P note and a rattle. This is terminal trill. So in addition to measuring these parts of the length and frequency of these song parameters, we also developed a repertoire. So here's the 51 syllables we used to characterize the syllable repertoire of each male to look at how large his overall repertoire was, as well as how complex was it relative to the other males. So collectively, we measured 28 traits comprising morphology, color, and song for 49 males, and developed this trait correlation matrix. Boom. So there's 378 pairwise comparisons, so it's really obvious how these traits relate to each other. Not really. So we could alternatively break this down and visualize it as a network based on correlations of greater than 0.3. So we can start with morphology. So here, not too surprisingly, tail streamer and right wing length are strongly correlated with each other, probably because they have a similar underlying physiological basis. So what about color? So here we have really strong clustering for most of our color traits, whereas this one dimension of color, this is chromatic color, the breast and belly hue are unrelated. And what about song? So song is all over the place. So this is pretty interesting immediately to me because some song traits are closer related to some aspects of color than to any other song trait. But although this network does tell you something about the probable or the potential for redundancy within the network, it doesn't tell you anything about function. So we can gain greater information by doing model selection to determine which aspects of phenotype predict different aspects of sexual selection. So for example, we looked at female choice. So our surrogate for female choice here was percent of genetic offspring, which is important to consider because in this species we have a lot of extra pair population, funny business going on. So just as an example here, we show a consistent relationship between this particular trait measure and percent genetic offspring. And so we used AIC model selection to determine actually which of these traits predict reproductive this aspect of reproductive success, and these are colored blue in this example. Alternatively, we could look at the contributions of male-male competition and say, okay, well, how much does intersexual selection contribute to signal evolution and which traits are involved? So our surrogate for male-male competition was the physical spacing of competing males. So which traits predicted the closest distance to a neighboring competitor? and we're going to color code